The road was almost empty when the last bit of sunlight began to fade behind the trees. The air was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes people slow down without even noticing. A dark sedan moved along the lane calmly, keeping its distance from every other car. The driver didn't seem in a hurry. He didn't look to the left or right. He simply kept his hands on the wheel, steady and relaxed. A patrol car was parked on the shoulder not far ahead. Inside it sat an officer who had already dealt with more stress that week than he wanted to admit. He had started his shift with a headache and a feeling that everything around him was either going too fast or not fast enough. He watched every car passing by like he was waiting for something to go wrong. His nerves were tight, and his patience was thin. When he noticed the sedan moving slightly under the speed limit, he narrowed his eyes. He leaned forward, studying it, as if the car was hiding a secret. The sedan drifted a little within the lane. Not enough to be dangerous, but enough to make him think the driver might be distracted. Instead of taking a breath and observing a bit longer, he let his irritation guide him. He turned on his lights with one firm tap. The red and blue flashed across the darkening road as he pulled out behind the sedan. The sedan slowed down carefully and pulled over with no hesitation. Everything about the stop so far was peaceful, even routine. But the officer didn't feel that way. The pressure sitting on his shoulders made him see problems where none existed. He walked toward the car with heavy steps. His hand hovered near his belt, not touching anything, but close enough to show how tense he was. The window rolled down slowly, and the driver looked up with calm eyes. He appeared completely composed, almost too composed in the officer's mind. "Good evening, officer," the driver said in a steady tone. The officer thought the calmness sounded rehearsed. He didn't like that feeling, even though there was nothing unusual about it. He asked for the driver's license and registration, his voice sharp without him meaning it to be. The driver kept both hands on the steering wheel and answered politely, explaining that his documents were in the glove box. He said he would reach for them only if the officer was okay with it. He spoke with patience that many people wouldn't have during a stop. But instead of appreciating it, the officer felt as if the man was being too smooth, too relaxed. His mind jumped to unnecessary conclusions. He wondered if the calm was an act. He wondered if the driver was hiding something. The stress of the week made his thoughts spiral faster than reality. "Step out of the car," the officer said suddenly. The driver looked confused but not upset. He gently asked if something was wrong, still keeping his hands on the wheel. The officer felt the question as a challenge when it was nothing more than a normal human reaction. "I said, 'Step out,'" the officer repeated, louder this time. The driver took a slow breath, still trying to keep the situation safe. He mentioned again that he just needed to show his documents so the officer could confirm everything. He spoke with such softness that anyone else might have felt reassured. But the officer's nerves twisted it into something else. When the driver finally reached toward the glove box after asking if it was okay, the officer misread the movement instantly. His mind filled with fear and the worst possibilities. Before thinking twice, he pulled his gun. The sudden motion filled the air with tension, sharp and cold. "Don't move." The officer shouted. The driver froze in place, his expression still calm but now clearly worried about the officer's reaction. He lifted his hands slowly, showing they were empty. His heart beat faster, but he kept his voice steady. He did everything he could to avoid making the situation worse. A car driving by slowed down, the passengers turning their heads when they saw the flashing lights and heard the officer's raised voice. A neighbor sitting on their porch across the street took out their phone and began recording without saying a word. The officer kept yelling instructions, some of them repeating, some of them contradicting themselves. He wasn't thinking clearly anymore. His own stress had taken control of the moment. The man in the car spoke calmly, trying to reassure him. He explained slowly and clearly that there must be a misunderstanding. He even offered to wait for backup if that made the officer feel safer. But nothing he said reached the officer's ears the way it should have. Minutes felt much longer than they were. The situation had shifted from a simple traffic stop to a dangerous misunderstanding, all because one person let fear guide his actions instead of reason. The quiet driver remained still, refusing to let panic take over. He had been in tense situations before, though this was not one he had expected on a quiet suburban road. He understood something important. Any wrong move, even an innocent one, could make things spiral. As more cars passed, some drivers slowed down to stare. The flashing lights reflected off windows, turning the peaceful road into a scene full of tension. The officer's hands shook slightly, though he tried to hide it. His fingers stayed near the trigger as he waited for backup to arrive. The only person who seemed truly calm was the driver, sitting there with both hands raised, breathing steadily. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He didn't make any sudden motions. He simply waited, even though anyone in his place would have been frightened. In his mind, he knew that moments like this could define the future for both men. He knew that fear could make a person see danger where none existed. And he knew that staying calm was the only way to keep the situation from getting worse. The officer, however, felt trapped in his own racing thoughts. Every second felt like a threat. Every small movement felt suspicious. Instead of relying on his training, he relied on instinct born from stress and exhaustion. The sound of distant sirens finally broke through the tense air. Backup was arriving. The driver closed his eyes for a brief moment, almost relieved. He hoped the new officers would bring clarity to the situation. The patrol cars pulled up behind the first one, lights bright and spinning. Two officers stepped out, looking surprised at the sight of their colleague with his gun raised at a man who was sitting completely still. One of them approached carefully, trying to understand what was happening. He asked the first officer what the problem was, but the explanation he received didn't make much sense. He looked at the driver, then back at the officer. Sensing something was off, the backup officers could feel the tension in the air. But they also saw that the driver didn't pose any threat at all. His hands were raised, his posture calm, his voice quiet. The situation had started as nothing more than a simple misunderstanding, but a combination of stress, assumptions, and fear had turned it into something that made everyone uneasy. As more officers arrived, the road filled with flashing lights. Curious neighbors stepped outside their houses, watching from a distance. The person recording from their porch kept filming quietly, sensing that something about this stop didn't feel right. The original officer kept his gun raised, his voice shaky now. It wasn't anger anymore. It was fear. And the calmness of the driver, the very thing that should have brought peace, only made the officer more confused. The driver spoke again gently, explaining he hadn't done anything threatening. He reminded the officers that he had simply been reaching for his registration, which he had clearly announced beforehand. His voice was steady but layered with concern. One of the backup officers nodded slowly, trying to ease the tension. He asked the driver to stay still just a bit longer while they sorted everything out. His tone was more balanced, more controlled. The officer who started the stop looked around at his colleagues, feeling a wave of embarrassment mixing with fear. He hadn't meant for things to reach this point. He hadn't meant to pull his weapon that quickly. But now he was trapped in the moment, unsure how to pull back without looking like he had overreacted. None of the backup officers wanted to escalate things further. They communicated quietly among themselves, trying to understand how a peaceful stop became so extreme. The driver kept breathing slowly, watching the anxiety in the officer's eyes. He knew that nothing good would come from reacting emotionally. He stayed as steady as he could, hoping the situation would calm down as soon as the others took control. The entire moment felt like time was stretching. Like the road had become a small world where fear controlled one side and patience controlled the other. Soon, one of the supervisors arrived. The atmosphere shifted the moment he stepped onto the scene. His presence alone made the other officers stand straighter, and the tension dropped just a little. The driver watched quietly, knowing that the next few minutes would decide how this would all end, and the officer who pointed the gun wondered, for the first time, if he had made a mistake far bigger than he could admit. The sun had completely disappeared now, leaving only the flashing lights and the growing crowd of onlookers. The driver, still calm, waited for the truth of the situation to come out. In his mind, he hoped everyone would walk away safely, but no one there knew the full story. Yet, they didn't know who the calm driver really was. And that truth was about to change everything. The supervisor stepped out of his vehicle with a calm confidence that immediately softened the tension in the air. He had been through enough complicated situations in his career to sense when something was truly dangerous and when something was simply spiraling because someone lost control of their emotions. And as he walked closer, he could already tell this moment belonged to the second group. He looked at the officer holding the gun and noticed how tightly his hand gripped the weapon. The officer's breathing was uneven, and his eyes darted back and forth between the driver and the backup officers. It was clear he wasn't thinking straight. The supervisor quietly approached him and placed a hand on his arm, not to surprise him, but to give him a grounding point. "Take a breath," the supervisor said under his breath. The officer swallowed hard, but his arm stayed stiff. His mind was too tangled in fear, pride, and confusion. He didn't want to lower the gun, but he also didn't know how to stay in control of the moment now that backup had arrived. The driver inside the car watched everything silently. His hands were still raised. His posture was still calm. He hadn't moved an inch. He understood that any sudden motion could be misunderstood, especially with an officer who was clearly on edge. The supervisor stepped closer to the driver's window, keeping his voice steady and respectful. He greeted the driver gently and asked if he was okay. The driver nodded slightly without lowering his hands. His voice was quiet when he spoke, controlled but not shaky. "I'm all right," he said softly. "I only reached for my registration after telling him first." The supervisor nodded, already sensing that the escalation had more to do with the officer's stress than the driver's actions. He asked the driver to stay still just a bit longer while they sorted things out. The driver agreed without hesitation. He didn't complain. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't throw blame at anyone. He understood the seriousness of the moment and chose patience over frustration. Meanwhile, the backup officers exchanged quiet glances, each one wondering how the stop had flown so far out of control. They had responded thinking there was some major threat, but all they saw was a calm man in a car and an officer whose nerves had clearly snapped. The supervisor returned to the officer who initiated the stop. He spoke to him privately, pulling him a little aside while still keeping the driver in view. He tried to convince him to lower his weapon, explaining gently that the situation didn't match the level of force being used. But the officer continued to argue that the driver had moved too suddenly. He was reaching for the glove box. The officer insisted. "Yes," the supervisor replied calmly, "and he asked for your permission before doing it." "You agreed?" The officer clenched his jaw. The idea of backing down now felt like admitting he had reacted too fast. He didn't want to look weak in front of the others. He didn't want to look foolish. Sometimes pride can fuel fear, and in that moment, they worked together in the worst way. The supervisor gave him a firm look, not angry, just steady. "This is not the moment for ego," he said quietly. "This is the moment to regain control the right way." A long moment passed. Slowly, the officer's shoulders began to drop. His grip on the gun loosened, just enough for the supervisor to know he was listening. The supervisor gently guided the barrel downward and asked him to holster it. The officer hesitated, but finally did, sliding the weapon back into place. His hands trembled slightly as he stepped backward. Putting distance between himself and the situation, the backup officer sighed in relief, though no one said a word. The tension in the air thinned, though it didn't disappear completely. The driver lowered his hands only when the supervisor told him it was safe to do so. He rubbed his fingers together briefly, the only sign that the stress of having a gun pointed at him was finally hitting him. The supervisor asked the driver for his identification. This time, the driver reached slowly and clearly toward the glove box, narrating each movement so everyone could see what he was doing. The backup officers watched closely, but none felt threatened. The supervisor looked over the documents carefully. As he read the name printed on the license, something shifted in his expression. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He glanced at the driver, studying his face with a new understanding. He cleared his throat softly. "Is this accurate?" he asked quietly. The driver nodded once. "Yes," he answered. "That is who I am." The supervisor took a step back, stunned, but trying not to show it. He exchanged a look with one of the backup officers, who also realized the weight of the moment. The driver sitting in the car was not just another citizen. He was someone whose presence demanded a different level of awareness, not because of authority, but because of responsibility. He was the head of one of the most important federal agencies in the country. The supervisor inhaled deeply, trying to stay composed. He approached the officer who had started the stop and called him aside once more. This time, his voice carried more seriousness. "We need to talk," the supervisor said. The officer frowned, confused. "About what?" "About who you pulled over," the supervisor said carefully. The officer's eyes flicked toward the car, then back to the supervisor. "Who is he?" he asked. The supervisor hesitated for a moment, trying to decide how to explain it in the calmest way possible. "He's the director of the FBI," he said quietly. The officer felt the ground shift beneath him. His stomach dropped. His heart thumped loudly in his chest. He looked toward the driver again, suddenly seeing him in a completely different light, not as a threat, not as someone suspicious, but as someone who held one of the most trusted positions in the country. The officer's face went pale. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what to think. Everything in the last few minutes replayed in his mind, sharper and louder than before, drawing his gun, shouting, misreading. Every movement he felt sick. The supervisor didn't lecture him, though the disappointment in his eyes was clear. "You let your stress take over," he said simply, "and it almost turned into something you wouldn't come back from." The officer swallowed again, unable to respond. He wanted to apologize, but the words stuck in his throat. Meanwhile, the driver stepped out of the car at the supervisor's request. He moved slowly, not wanting to add to the officer's panic. Once he stood outside, he took a moment to straighten his jacket and breathe the cool evening air. Despite everything that had happened, he stayed composed. The supervisor approached him with respect, apologizing on behalf of the department. The driver accepted it with grace, explaining that he understood how high-pressure situations could cloud judgment. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't demand punishment. He didn't speak with superiority. Instead, he said something none of the officers expected. "I've seen fear affect good people before," he said calmly. "It's how we handle the aftermath that matters." His words landed heavily in the air. Even the officer who had made the mistake heard them clearly. A few neighbors had gathered now, standing farther down the sidewalk, watching curiously but not approaching. The person recording from the porch continued to film. Knowing something important was happening, the driver turned to the supervisor and asked if he could have a brief word with the officer who had pulled the gun. The request surprised everyone, including the officer himself. The supervisor hesitated, but eventually nodded. He turned to the officer. "He wants to speak with you," he said. The officer's mouth felt dry. He didn't want to face him, not after what he had done. But refusing wasn't an option. He walked toward the driver slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he finally reached him, he couldn't meet his eyes. "I'm sorry," the officer said, his voice barely audible. The driver looked at him with a calm expression, not angry, just thoughtful. "I know you were scared," the driver said gently. "But fear can't be the thing that guides your actions. Not in your job." The officer nodded, feeling the truth of those words press against his chest. "You need to breathe before you react," the driver continued. "You need to see the person in front of you, not the fear in your own head." The officer blinked back, the emotion rising in his eyes. He had expected anger, shouting, maybe even a threat to end his career right there. But instead, he heard wisdom and calm. "I never meant to frighten you," the officer said. "I know," the driver replied, "but sometimes intention doesn't matter as much as the result." The officer nodded again. Unable to speak, the backup officers watched from a distance. Surprised at how gentle the conversation had become after such a tense situation, the driver stepped back toward his car, preparing to leave now that things were under control. The supervisor thanked him again for his patience. The driver simply nodded and said he hoped the rest of their night would be less stressful. He got back into his car, closed the door, and started the engine. For a moment, He sat there, breathing deeply. Then he pulled away slowly, disappearing down the quiet road. The officers stood in silence for a while after he left. The backup team eventually returned to their vehicles, the flashing lights slowly fading. The officer who had pulled the gun stood alone for a moment, staring at the empty space where the sedan had been. He knew this moment would follow him for a long time, and he knew it wasn't over. There would be consequences. He only hoped they wouldn't destroy everything he had worked for. The night air felt heavier after the sedan disappeared down the road. The flashing lights from the patrol cars cast shadows that moved slowly across the pavement. No one spoke at first. The silence between the officers wasn't empty. It was full of things no one wanted to say out loud. The officer who had drawn his gun stood with his hands at his sides, staring at the ground. His breathing had steadied, but his thoughts had not. Every moment of the stop replayed in his mind, each second sharper than the last. He felt the weight of it pressing on his chest, making it hard to stand still. The supervisor stayed near him, giving him a chance to gather himself. He didn't yell. He didn't lecture. He simply watched him, understanding that the officer already knew how badly the situation had gone. "Let's head back to the station," the supervisor finally said. His tone was calm, but it left no room for debate. The officer nodded and walked toward his patrol car. His legs felt stiff, like they weren't entirely sure how to move. He climbed inside and closed the door gently, afraid even the sound of it clicking shut would feel too loud. As they drove back to the station, he kept his eyes on the road, though his mind was miles away. He thought about the look on the driver's face, not angry, not scared, but calm in a way that almost made him feel worse. That calmness wasn't weakness. It was strength, and he had pointed a gun at someone who had shown nothing but patience. At the station, the lights were still on, even though the night had grown late. A few officers sat at their desks finishing paperwork. Others walked through the hall with tired steps. But when the officer and the supervisor walked in, everyone seemed to sense something had happened. No one asked questions, but the looks they exchanged were enough. Concern, curiosity, unspoken. Judgment. The supervisor gestured for the officer to follow him into one of the small meeting rooms. The walls were plain, the tables simple, the chairs slightly worn. It was the kind of room where many difficult conversations had taken place before. "Sit down," the supervisor said. The officer obeyed, feeling like a student waiting for a serious talk from a teacher. The supervisor sat across from him, folding his hands on the table. "Walk me through it," the supervisor said. The officer hesitated. "You already saw what happened. I need to hear it from you," the supervisor replied. "In your own words?" The officer took a deep breath, explained how he had seen the sedan drifting slightly, how he had felt something was off, how the calmness of the driver made him uneasy. As he spoke, he realized how thin his reason sounded. The more he talked, the more he understood that it wasn't the driver who had caused the problem. It was everything inside him, his stress, his exhaustion, his fear that something might go wrong. When he finished, the supervisor leaned back in his chair. "You know this is serious," he said. The officer nodded slowly. "I know. You pointed your gun at a man who did nothing threatening. A man who told you exactly what he was doing before he did it." "I know," the officer repeated, but quieter this time. "And that man wasn't just anyone," the supervisor continued. "He's the head of the FBI. That changes how this is going to be handled." The officer closed his eyes briefly. "I messed up. I know I did." The supervisor studied him for a moment. "You didn't just mess up," he said. "You let fear take control, and that can't happen. Not in this job. Not ever." The officer's jaw tightened as he tried to keep his emotions steady. "You're not a bad person," the supervisor added. "But tonight you made a decision that could have ended terribly. We have to deal with that." The officer nodded again, this time with a quiet acceptance. "We're opening an internal review," the supervisor said. "You'll be placed on administrative leave while it's happening." The words hit harder than the officer expected. Leave. That word always carried a shadow behind it. "I understand," he said. The supervisor sighed. Go home. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be a long day. The officer left the station feeling heavier than when he walked in. The night air was cool against his face, but it didn't calm his thoughts. He climbed into his car and sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel with both hands. The drive home was quiet. Too quiet. His neighborhood looked the same as always, the small houses, the dim streetlights, the silent yards, but he felt different inside. When he stepped inside his home, he didn't turn on the lights. He took off his uniform slowly and sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor. He wondered what would happen next. He wondered if this mistake would define him forever. The next morning, the department buzzed with conversation. Word about the incident had spread quickly, especially after a neighbor posted the video online. People watched it with wide eyes, wondering how a calm driver ended up with a gun pointed at him. The comments online were filled with opinions, some harsh, some understanding, some confused, and some angry. But none of them knew the full story yet. None of them knew who the driver was or how he had handled the situation. At the department, the supervisor had already called for a meeting. A group of senior staff and internal affairs officers gathered in a small conference room. The atmosphere was serious but controlled. They watched the video together. They analyzed the officer's movements, his tone, his reactions. They noted how the driver had behaved, steady, patient, cooperative. Then the supervisor explained what he had learned about the driver. The room grew silent when they heard the title of the man involved, not out of fear, but out of the realization that the situation was far more delicate than it appeared. Meanwhile, the driver, now back at his office in a federal building, sat with a cup of tea in front of him. His staff moved around the room, bringing files, asking questions, preparing for the day. But he couldn't shake the memory of the officer's trembling hands, the panic in his voice. He knew the officer wasn't malicious. He was overwhelmed, unsteady, drowning in stress he didn't know how to handle, and the driver couldn't forget. The words he had spoken to him, "Fear can't be the thing that guides your actions." He believed those words deeply. They weren't said for show. They were said because he meant them. Later that afternoon, he received a call from a senior official at the police department. They apologized again, explained the internal review, and promised transparency. The driver listened carefully, but he didn't demand punishment or threaten consequences. All he asked for was honesty. The officer, still at home, sat at his kitchen table staring at his silent phone. He wondered if he should call someone. He wondered if he should try to explain himself to the department, or if he should simply wait. He felt a hollow ache in his chest, not just because of the consequences he knew were coming, but because he had truly frightened a man who did nothing wrong. Later that evening, the supervisor called him. "They want you to come in tomorrow morning," the supervisor said. The officer closed his eyes. "All right, try to sleep," the supervisor added. "You'll need it." Morning came too quickly. The officer put on a plain shirt instead of his uniform and drove to the station. The halls felt different when he wasn't in uniform. He felt exposed, small, like everyone could see his mistake written across him. He was led into a meeting room where several members of the internal review board sat. They didn't treat him unkindly, but they didn't treat him softly either. They asked detailed questions. They wanted to understand his mindset. They wanted to hear why he reacted the way he did. The officer answered honestly. He didn't try to excuse himself. He admitted he had been overwhelmed. He admitted he had let fear cloud his judgment. He admitted that the driver had done nothing wrong. When the questioning ended, he was told he would be notified when a decision was made. They thanked him for his honesty, but he could tell by their expressions that honesty alone wouldn't erase what had happened. A few days passed slowly. The officer spent most of his time at home, walking from room to room, unable to focus on anything. Checked his phone constantly, waiting for news. Finally, the call came. "We need you to come in," the supervisor said. Those words carried a weight the officer felt instantly. When he arrived at the station, the supervisor was waiting for him. The two walked together to the office of the chief. Apsar's hands felt cold. His heartbeat felt loud. Inside, the chief looked at him with a steady gaze. "We reviewed the incident thoroughly," the chief said. "We spoke with the driver. We examined the video. We've come to a decision." The officer swallowed. "You will be relieved of duty," the chief said, his tone firm but not cruel. effective immediately. The officer exhaled slowly, feeling the air leave his lungs in a way that made his chest ache. "We believe you're not beyond help. But in this job, judgment is everything," the chief continued. And this was a serious lapse in judgment. The officer nodded. There was nothing else he could do. The supervisor placed a hand on his shoulder gently. "Take this time to figure out what you need," he said softly. The officer handed over his badge and identification. The weight of the badge had once felt like purpose. Now it felt like a reminder. When he walked out of the building, the sunlight outside felt too bright. He sat in his car for a long time, staring ahead with empty eyes. He wasn't angry, wasn't surprised, but he felt lost. He had made a mistake, one that had cost him more than his job. It had cost him the image he had of himself, and he didn't yet know how to rebuild it. But the story wasn't finished. Not yet. He didn't know it. But someone else was thinking of him too. Someone who understood pressure. Someone who had faced fear and seen how it changes people. Someone who had once told him that what mattered most was how people handled the aftermath. And that person was not done with him. The supervisor's voice was calm, but everyone around could feel the tension in the air. Even the passing cars seemed to slow down as if they sensed something important was unfolding. The officer, who had pulled the gun earlier, stood frozen, his hands shaking slightly. It was as if the weight of what he had done was finally sinking in. The calm driver, the man who had been sitting inside the dark sedan, stepped out slowly when the supervisor gently asked him to. His movements were steady, controlled, and almost comforting to watch. There was no anger in his eyes, no fear either. He looked like someone who had learned long ago not to let the moment control him. Instead, he controlled the moment. The supervisor walked a little closer to him, lowering his voice. Their conversation wasn't loud, but even from a distance, the officer could see the shift in the supervisor's expression. First confusion, then recognition, then disbelief that made his eyes widen for a second. The calm driver finally said something that made the supervisor step back slightly. The officer couldn't hear the words, but he knew something serious had just been revealed. The other officers on the scene exchanged worried glances, silently wondering what was going on. It didn't take long before the supervisor turned around and waved the officers to lower their weapons. His voice carried a firmness that cut through the tension. "Stand down. Everyone, stand down." The officer's stomach dropped. He could feel a cold wave moving through his chest. He didn't understand yet, but he knew it wasn't good. Not good at all. The calm driver simply stood there, patient as ever, watching the officers with an expression that wasn't angry or proud. It was almost sad, as if this wasn't the first time he had seen something like this happen. A few minutes later, backup cars began to arrive slowly, but the supervisor quickly signaled them not to come any closer. Things were already tense enough. The officer who started the whole thing took a deep breath, but even that breath felt heavy. Finally, the supervisor approached him. "You need to understand something," the supervisor said quietly. "The man you just pulled a gun on, he's the director of the FBI." Everything around the officer went silent. Even the distant sounds of traffic faded into the background. His mind felt blank for a few seconds, as if it couldn't process what he had just heard. When the words finally settled in, he felt lightheaded. His legs weakened a little, and he had to shift his weight to stay steady. The supervisor wasn't scolding him, not yet. He was simply giving him the truth. But sometimes the truth hits harder than any anger could. He's here on a private meeting. He wasn't doing anything wrong. And he stayed calm the entire time, the supervisor went on. The officer swallowed hard. His mouth felt dry. His heart was pounding so loudly he could hear it echoing in his ears. The calm driver was still standing nearby. He wasn't walking away. He wasn't complaining. He wasn't yelling or threatening to sue. He was just watching the scene quietly, almost as if he was waiting for the right time to speak. A few moments later, he stepped forward. The officer braced himself, expecting anger even, if he knew he deserved it. But the calm driver's voice was steady. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm not going to make this more difficult for anyone," he said. "But I do want this handled correctly." His words were simple, but they carried weight. Even the younger officers on the scene straightened up. When they heard him speak, the supervisor nodded respectfully. "You have my word. We'll follow procedure on every step." The calm driver gave a small nod. His patience was almost unbelievable. Most people would have been furious, especially someone in his position. But he behaved like someone who had dealt with pressure his whole life. The officer lowered his gaze. He felt embarrassed, ashamed, and overwhelmed by a sense of guilt that grew heavier every second. He replayed the whole scene in his head, the raised voice, the drawn weapon, the assumptions he had made without thinking. Each memory stung. He knew he couldn't take any of it back. A few minutes later, supervisor gently guided the calm driver back toward his car so they could complete the process properly. The officer stayed behind, trying to steady his breathing. Two other officers approached him, not to judge him but to make sure he didn't faint. He tried to apologize, but the words got stuck in his throat. "Just take a minute," one of them quietly told him. The officer nodded, but he wasn't sure a minute would be enough soon after. The supervisor finished speaking to the calm driver and returned to address the rest of the officers. "Internal Affairs will handle this. Everyone's statements will be taken. Do not discuss this outside the department." It wasn't a warning, it was protocol. But the officer felt it like a weight on his shoulders. As the calm driver prepared to leave, he gave the officers one final look, not of anger, not of pride, but of understanding. It surprised the officer. He had expected the man to be furious, to demand he be fired immediately. But instead, the calm driver offered something unexpected. He offered a moment of silence. A moment that felt almost like forgiveness. When the car drove away, the officer watched it disappear down the road, the red taillights blinking faintly as they faded into the distance. The supervisor finally approached him again. "Look," he said softly, "you made a mistake. A serious one. But it's done now. What matters is how you take responsibility for it." The officer nodded slowly. He didn't try to defend himself. He didn't try to blame stress or fear or misunderstanding. He just listened. "Internal Affairs will reach out tonight or tomorrow," the supervisor continued. "They'll review the footage, the reports, everything." The officer looked down at the ground. The reality of what was coming next felt like a cold shadow settling around him. He wasn't worried about the paperwork. He wasn't worried about procedural reviews. He wasn't even worried about the suspension he knew was coming. He was worried about what kind of person he had allowed himself to become in that moment. He had acted out of fear, out of assumptions, and that wasn't who he wanted to be. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, washing the street in a soft orange glow, the officer stood there quietly, thinking about every choice he had made. He didn't know what the punishment would be yet. He didn't know what the future held, but he did know one thing for sure. The moment he pointed that gun at a calm, harmless driver had changed everything, and there was no going back now. The other officers slowly returned to their vehicles, their radios crackling gently. The scene dissolved into normal traffic again, as if nothing major had happened. But for the officer standing there, nothing would ever feel normal again. He waited for the supervisor's final instructions before heading back to his car. When he opened the door, the air inside felt stale and cold. He sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to process everything. The supervisor approached the window one last time and said quietly, "Go home for today. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." The officer nodded again, unable to form words, as he drove away. The streetlights slowly flickered on, one by one, like tiny reminders that even after a dark moment, there's always something waiting to light the way. He didn't know what redemption looked like yet, but somewhere deep inside, he hoped he would find it. The morning sun rose slowly over the quiet neighborhood where the former officer lived. Its warm light touched the edges of the curtains, slipping into the room where he sat alone at his kitchen table. A cup of tea sat in front of him, untouched and growing cold. He had barely slept the night before. Each time he closed his eyes, the memory of that night returned: the flashing lights, his shaking hands, the calm voice of the driver who had never once raised his tone. He replayed it again and again, not because he wanted to, but because his mind refused to let it go. He kept thinking about the moment he had drawn his weapon, He knew now how unnecessary it had been. He knew how wrong it had felt the moment he realized who the man was. But the driver hadn't reacted with anger. He hadn't lashed out. He hadn't used his position to belittle him. Instead, he had spoken gently, almost like someone who had seen that kind of fear before. Those words echoed in his mind. Fear can't be the thing that guides your actions. He sighed deeply and rubbed his face with both hands, trying to wipe away the heaviness sitting behind his eyes. The silence of the room pressed in around him. He didn't know what to do next. He didn't have a plan. He didn't even know if he still deserved to wear any kind of uniform again. Later that afternoon, while he was sitting on his living room couch, staring at nothing in particular, there was a knock at the door. It was soft, almost hesitant. He wasn't expecting anyone. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. But something pushed him to stand. He walked to the door slowly, unsure of who might be there. When he opened it, he froze. Standing on his front step was the same calm driver from that night, the director of the FBI. The officer's breath caught. In his throat, his heart jumped. He didn't know what to say. He felt unprepared, embarrassed, almost ashamed to even look him in the eye. "May I come in?" the driver asked in that same gentle tone. The officer nodded quickly and stepped aside. He felt like he should be apologizing before the man even stepped over the threshold. Once the door closed, the house felt too small, like the walls had pulled in closer. The driver looked around the living room briefly, not judging anything, simply observing. The officer felt the need to explain the mess he hadn't cleaned up, the papers on the table, the dishes in the sink. But the driver waved it off kindly. "Please," the driver said. "Let's sit." They both sat on opposite ends of the couch. For a few seconds, no words passed between them. The officer kept staring at his hands, feeling the weight of what he had done. Finally, he spoke. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm so sorry for how I acted. I didn't listen. I let everything get to me. I know I don't deserve you coming here." The driver watched him with calm eyes. "I didn't come here for an apology," he said. "You already said one that night." The officer shook his head. "It wasn't enough." "Maybe not," the driver replied softly. "But I'm not here to talk about what happened. I'm here to talk about what happens next." The officer looked up with confusion. "Next? Yes," the driver said. "You made a mistake. But mistakes don't have to be the end of a person's story." The officer blinked, unsure how to respond. The driver leaned forward slightly. "Do you know how many people I've met in my life who froze in a moment of fear?" he asked. "More than you can imagine. Fear is powerful. It can twist a situation, change a judgment, push someone into choices they regret. I've seen people panic during interviews, panic in the field, panic even when they're safe. Fear doesn't choose. It just arrives." The officer swallowed hard. "That doesn't excuse what I did." "No," the driver agreed. "It doesn't, but it explains something important. You're human." His chest felt tight. The driver continued. "You didn't draw that weapon because you wanted to hurt someone. You drew it because your mind convinced you something was wrong. You reacted to a fear that came from inside you, not from the situation itself. That doesn't make it right, but it makes it understandable." The officer lowered his head again. "It doesn't matter now. They already let me go." "I'm aware," the driver said. "I spoke with your department." The officer tensed. "You did?" "Yes," the driver replied. "Not to influence their decisions, just to make sure you weren't painted as something you're not." The officer looked at him with surprise. "Why would you do that?" "After everything?" The driver smiled faintly. "Because I saw who you were during the aftermath. You didn't argue. You didn't deny. You didn't make excuses. You faced what you did, even though it scared you. That says more about a person's character than a single mistake." The officer felt a sudden sting in his eyes and blinked. Quickly to hold back tears, "You shouldn't lose your entire future over one moment," the driver said. "Not if you're willing to learn from it." The officer swallowed. "I don't know what to do now. I don't know how to fix myself." "Fixing yourself isn't the goal," the driver said gently. "Understanding yourself They sat in silence for a moment. The officer stared at the floor, trying to calm his breathing. The driver continued. You need time. Time to rest. Time to reflect. Time to figure out what part of you needs healing. The officer nodded slowly. I've been thinking. Maybe I shouldn't work in law enforcement anymore. The driver tilted his head. Maybe, he said. Or maybe you could come back to it later with a better understanding of your own limits. People grow the most after moments like these. The officer felt something shift inside him, fear, mixed with hope. What if this mistake stays with me forever? The officer asked. It will, the driver said simply, but not in the way you think. Mistakes don't disappear, but they can change shape. They can become warnings, lessons, or even reasons you become stronger. The officer exhaled shakily. I don't know if I'm strong enough for that. You are, the driver said. I wouldn't be here if I believed otherwise. The room felt heavier, but in a different way, like pressure and more like something settling into place, something that needed to be felt. I have a suggestion, the driver finally said. Only a suggestion. The officer straightened slightly. Listening, there are programs, the driver continued, for former officers who need time to recover, to rebuild themselves, to learn how to manage fear and stress properly. They're not punishment. They're guidance. The officer looked confused. Why are you offering this to me? The driver smiled kindly. Because you're not the first person who has needed help. And because you listened when I spoke that night, you didn't argue. You didn't try to justify your actions. You absorbed every word. That tells me you have the capacity to grow. The officer felt tears finally spill from the corners of his eyes. He wiped them quickly, embarrassed. There's no shame in emotion, the driver said softly. It means you care. People who care can change. People who don't care never do. The officer nodded, unable to speak. The driver placed a folder on the coffee table. Inside are resources, he said. Places you can go. People who can help. You don't have to choose now. Just know you're not alone in this. The officer stared at the folder like it was a lifeline he didn't think he deserved. The driver stood slowly. I should go. I've taken enough of your time. The officer stood too, almost on instinct. Thank you, he said, his voice breaking slightly. I don't know how to express how much this means. You don't need to, the driver replied. Just use it. Let this be a turning point, not the end. They walked to the door together. When the driver stepped outside, he paused and looked back one last time. One more thing, he said. Don't hide from the world. Face it. You'll see that some people fall, but the ones who stand again become better than before. The officer nodded, holding the doorframe for support. I'll try, he whispered. That's all anyone can do, the driver said with a warm smile. Then he walked away, leaving the former officer standing at the doorway, watching until the car disappeared around the corner. For the first time in days, the officer felt something small but important inside him, hope. It wasn't loud. It wasn't bright. But it was real. He closed the door gently and looked at the folder on the table. He walked over, picked it up, and held it in his hands for a long moment. Maybe this wasn't the end of his story. Maybe it was the beginning of a new one. And maybe, just maybe, the calmness of one man had saved him in more ways than one. He sat down at the table, opened the folder, and read the first page. For the first time since the night of the incident, he breathed without feeling fear, and the story, though filled with mistakes, ended with something stronger than failure. It ended with growth, and the quiet belief that everyone, no matter how lost they feel, can find their way back if someone shows them a little patience.